Lecture 4, on Ethics, Contemporary Moral Problems. 1. Aristotelian Virtue Ethics. Introduction. Aristotle is perhaps the most important academic of all time. I say academic instead of philosopher or intellectual, because what came to be modern academia resulted, in large part, from the wide breadth of disciplines pioneered by Aristotle. Some of these disciplines were not improved upon for over 1,000 years after his death. Indeed, if there hadn't been an Aristotle, who knows where we would be in terms of science, philosophy, and technology today. We may still be traveling by horse and buggy, reading by candlelight, and dying from measles. While our previous theorists focused on the actions of agents for moral assessment, Aristotle's lens focuses on the agents themselves for moral assessments. 2. The function argument. As it says in our text, Aristotle was a teleologist. The root word, telos, means end, or goal, and Aristotle is said to be a teleologist because he believes all objects and beings have a telos, and that telos is directly relevant to the good of objects and beings. Our text has also been using consequentialist and teleological, almost, interchangeably. To alleviate this ambiguity, in all discussions teleology will be parsed out of consequentialism, since it makes things clearer and nothing remarkable will be lost in the process. Just remember that Aristotle is a teleologist concerned with virtue, Kant is a deontologist concerned with duty, and utilitarians are consequentialists concerned with utility. The function argument has to do with Aristotle's conception of explanation. Aristotle was the first to approach the concept of explanation, among many other things, in a systematic way. This is likely due to his education under Plato in the Socratic tradition. I can imagine Plato engaging a young Aristotle in the maieutic method, asking, "But what do you mean by explanation?" The frustration that may have led to Aristotle's development as an academic powerhouse was probably comparable to the frustration that led to the execution of Socrates by the Athenians. To Aristotle, an explanation of anything, whether object or being, required an appeal to 4 causes. The first cause is the material cause, that is, what the thing is made of. Using the example of a chair from our text, the material cause would be the wood used to construct the chair. The second cause is the efficient cause, that is, the source of the object or being's manifestation, development, or stability. For a chair, the efficient cause would be the activities of carpenters. The efficient cause is the closest of Aristotle's causes to our use of the word today. The third cause is the formal cause. Essentially, the formal cause is the form, shape, or design of the chair that makes it an object suitable for sitting on. The fourth, and final cause, is the end, or goal of the object or being. What the final cause of a thing is what the thing is for. For example, the chair is for sitting on. This is how we can assess the good of anything, object or being. If the chair is comfortable and easy to sit on, then it is good, because it achieves its final cause well. Let us look at other examples of objects and beings to further illustrate this teleology. Consider a knife. The material cause is the metal from which it is constructed, the efficient cause is the knife maker who manufactured it, the formal cause is the shape the knife maker chose, and the final cause is how well the knife cuts, its purpose. In Aristotle's terms, the virtue of a knife is its sharpness, how well it achieves its final cause, that is, its end or goal. Consider now a football player. The material cause is the living and rational flesh and bones that the football player is composed of, the efficient cause is the God who willed the football player's existence, the parents that came together to give birth to, and raise the football player, or the coach who trained the football player. The formal cause is owed to the God or genetics that determined the football player's structure. The final cause is how the football player affects the team's victories. If the football player's skills lead, or contribute to, victories for the team, then the football player is good. The virtue of a football player, like the knife's sharpness, is playing football well, leading or contributing to victories, or at least, fewer substantial losses, depending on the team. What must be clear for both examples of the knife and the football player, is that, for Aristotle as a teleologist, the telos of a knife is to cut well and the telos of a football player is to play football well. Again, this applies to objects, beings, and agents alike. Aristotle's function argument is supposed to work as follows: with regard to objects, natural or created, they have a function that is determined by nature or the user, and their functionality determines their goodness. With regard to living things, their goodness is also determined by their function. Beginning with the lowest life form, plants, whose function is mere growth, their virtue is in their ability to grow well. Therefore, a plant, or nutritive soul, that is in a position to enjoy rich soil, adequate water, and proper sunlight, can be said to be flourishing. Similarly, moving up the food chain, if an animal, an appetitive soul, has the same minimal conditions as the plant, namely, nutrition, then it will survive, but since animals have the added capability of locomotion, they can only be said to be flourishing if they have freedom of movement as well. This should be intuitive from the animal rights protests surrounding factory farm conditions of cows, pigs, and chickens. Furthermore, humans who are deprived of nutrition and space, such as concentration camp prisoners, cannot be said to be flourishing. Furthermore, since humans have the additional ability of reason, even when granted the lower necessities of nutrition and space, humans will still require more with regard to reason. Humans cannot be said to be flourishing unless they are able to maximize nutrition, the nutritive soul, mobility, the appetitive soul, and reason, the rational soul. Therefore, just as a farmer or botanist can tell us what leads to plants flourishing, a veterinarian or shepherd can tell us what leads to animals flourishing, and a philosopher, anthropologist, or psychologist can tell us what leads to human flourishing. 3. Aristotelian goodness. Just as Aristotle identifies the telos of objects, such as chairs, and beings, such as artists, and demonstrates that the telos of each determines how good of a chair or artist each is, he also claims that there is a telos for humans in general. What is particular to the chair is that it is designed for sitting on, and what is particular to the artist is that the artist produces art, these being the telos of the chair and the artist. If we look at human beings in general, we can see that our telos cannot be the same as plants, since we also have the mobility and appetites of animals. However, our telos cannot be the same as animals since we have the further capability of reason. Therefore, what is particular to humans is reason, so what makes a human good is reasoning well. Reasoning well, of course, leads one to act in accordance with reason, and acting in accordance with reason is to be virtuous. This virtuous virtuosity, exercising and developing our reason to its fullest potential, is necessary for what the ancient Greeks called eudaimonia, which means happiness, fulfillment, or flourishing. A person's life can only be truly happy, fulfilled, or flourishing, when it involves, as Aristotle puts it, the active exercise of the mind in conformity with perfect goodness or virtue. Therefore, eudaimonia is not achieved by satisfying the lower needs of our nutritive and appetitive natures alone, it is achieved when the lower needs are satisfied along with the higher needs, that are particular to us, namely, the needs of our rational souls. For eudaimonia and virtue, according to Aristotle, virtues are character dispositions or personality traits that are characterized by moral or intellectual excellence. In short, virtue is the excellence of being human. This focus on our dispositions and our character, rather than our actions in isolation, is what makes Aristotle's virtue ethics lens an agent-centered moral theory rather than an act-centered moral theory. Utilitarianism and Kantian ethics are two different examples of act-centered moral theories because their ethical lenses focus on actions when it comes to making moral assessments and judgments. Act-centered moral theories may be consequentialist or deontological, objectivist or relativist, but they share a common worldview in that particular actions are bearers of moral value, either being right or wrong. As an agent-centered theory, when faced with moral problems, the central question isn't what should I do? The question is, how should I be, with regard to virtue? For example, if you are a judge, a parent, or any other such authority figure in a position to distribute punishment, the question in such a case is, would it be just of me to prescribe this punishment? The virtue in question being justice. Perhaps a victim demands incarceration for someone who offended them. Would you be a just person if you incarcerated the offender? Or would it be more appropriate to request a public apology? Of course, as a parent or a military officer, you could demand a public apology, lest the offense be escalated to disobeying your parent or superior officer. Of course, the type of offense would be a factor to consider, but what is the rationally acceptable extent of punishment for merely offensive behavior? What's more, these escalations and extensions to the original offense would require the same type of ethical deliberation. As it says in our text, being virtuous, in part, means recognizing proper responses to, or interactions with, the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way. Furthermore, as it also says in our text, this is not always easy. This necessary recognition of what is right, in part led to an ancient definition of virtue as knowledge of good and evil. Achieving this capability of recognition requires developing a virtuous disposition, characterized by the golden mean. In this sense, critical thinking abilities and abstract thought appear necessary for the virtue constituting knowledge of good and evil that elucidates virtuous courses of action. For example, soldiers are as courageous when they break contact with an enemy strategically as they are when they engage the enemy under acceptable odds and conditions. When a soldier is paralyzed by fear or retreats, this may be cowardice, but when they carelessly walk into certain death, this is foolhardiness. Furthermore, as this is an agent-centered view, a single act may not be able to tell us anything about a person's virtue definitively. It is the behavior of the person over time that reveals their virtue. It is unrealistic to not allow for instances of behavior that are out of character. Indeed, as our text says, a person can be a charitable person without donating to charity at every opportunity. 5. Developing the virtues. Our text corrects a common misattribution. It was Will Durant, not Aristotle, who said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act but a habit, though this does accurately sum up Aristotle's view. Aristotle explains that the process of developing moral virtue is one of habituation. Unlike the process of attaining natural things, like sight or hearing, for which we first acquire the potentiality and later exhibit the activity, the virtues we get first by exercising. Practicing moderation in both passions and actions will increase mental health, and as mental health is increased, moderation will become habitual, reflexive, and appear more desirable. Since habitual acts and processes require less thought, if any, and self-control than those that are not habituated, as one acts virtuous, as long as this behavior is maintained, one's effortful virtue will abate. Furthermore, becoming virtuous is more than just the acquisition of a strength or skill, it is also the acquisition of a lifestyle in which temptations are both fewer and weaker. According to Aristotle, virtue is a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess and that which depends on defect, and again, it is a mean because the vices respectively fall short of or exceed what is right in both passions and actions, while virtue both finds and chooses that which is intermediate. Hence, in respect of its substance and the definition which states its essence, virtue is a mean, with regard to what is best and right and extreme. 6. Practical wisdom, phronesis. While our text identifies phronesis, or practical wisdom, as the skill or attribute we ought to develop in order to become more virtuous, I would argue that sophrosuna, usually translated as temperance, is the better candidate. In fact, Aristotle sometimes used phronesis and sophrosuna interchangeably. I would further argue, after comparing the ancient texts with modern research in psychology, that a better translation of sophrosuna would be conscientiousness. Though our text correctly claims that it is by developing our skill of phronesis that we become better at ascertaining what exactly virtue amounts to in a specific situation and how exactly we might achieve it, sophrosuna, or conscientiousness, may be a better target for our conditioning. Indeed, conscientiousness is commonly conceived as the condition or quality of being conscientious, that is, governed by or conforming to the dictates of conscience, in other words, having moral integrity, acting in strict regard for what is considered right or proper, scrupulous. For example, consider Plato's Charmides, in which sophrosuna is once defined as doing one's own things, or, in modern language, minding one's own business. There is no clear line between minding one's own business, interfering in someone else's affairs, and assisting when doing so would be virtuous. Being conscientious means understanding the difference between these. Improving conscientiousness and improving practical wisdom appear the same in this regard. Therefore, improving one's conscientiousness is to improve one's practical wisdom, which is necessary to becoming virtuous. For example, if we become more conscientious, we will better understand in what situations our actions constitute necessary intervention and in what situations they constitute inappropriate meddling. This skill, or disposition, is paramount in our ability to become virtuous. 7. Voluntary actions, involuntary actions, and moral responsibility. Aristotle's conception of moral responsibility depends, in part, on whether or not an agent's actions are voluntary or involuntary. Aristotle's view is intuitive regarding involuntary actions. For example, we wouldn't blame someone for breaking a table if they were pushed and subsequently fell on it. Indeed, we would likely blame the person who voluntarily pushed the person that fell on the table, because the pusher acted voluntarily and the person who fell broke the table as a result of the other's voluntary action. Similarly, if a person is under the psychological duress of being held at gunpoint, the actions they are instructed to perform may similarly shift the blame to the person with the gun giving the orders. Actions that result from ignorance and actions performed in ignorance are distinguished by Aristotle, and the attribution of responsibility is as well. For example, if the result of an attempted act of kindness results in harm, such as baking someone a cake and learning that they have an allergy to one of the ingredients. In such a case, the harm caused resulted from ignorance of the allergy, limiting the responsibility of the baker who was trying to do a nice thing. However, an action performed in ignorance may not warrant diminishment in our attribution of blame. For example, if someone chooses to become intoxicated and in their state of diminished capacities chooses to drive, they will still deserve blame as they chose that condition. 8. Objection, unclear guidance. A common, though trivial, objection is that virtue ethics does not provide clear guidance on specific actions in every situation. This objection could be waged against any moral theory. Since, as we've discussed, situations are ever-changing and what is impossible now may be possible at some point in the future. Whether using an Aristotelian, Kantian, or utilitarian ethical lens, we are always burdened with the necessity of conducting moral calculus to determine courses of action. Hence, this objection is only trivially true, though it would be nice if a moral theory provided a method as simple as a Google search. In any case, this may be an unrealistic demand. 9. Objection, clashing virtues. The objection of clashing virtues is a difficult case since, as Aristotle acknowledges, becoming virtuous takes a lifetime of practice and study. This is why phronesis and sophrosune are central to virtue in general. It is through the development of practical wisdom and conscientiousness that we improve our ability to recognize appropriate actions in these situations. 10. Objection, circularity. The objection of circularity arises from a resemblance between Aristotle's descriptions of virtuous people and a logical fallacy known as begging the question. Begging the question is called a circular argument because it uses the very conclusion it attempts to prove as a premise. For example, imagine someone claims, "I know God exists because it says so in the Bible, and I know the Bible is true because God wrote it." This is basically claiming that, "I know God exists because the Bible is true, and I know the Bible is true because God exists." The reasoning goes around in a circle as though unproven premises prove each other. This is formally similar to the claim that a person is virtuous because they act virtuously. However, it is quite different to say, someone is virtuous because they are virtuous than it is to say, I can tell someone is virtuous by observing their behavior. Indeed, it is the same for any skill. We can tell someone is a talented dancer by observing them dancing. 11. Objection, contribution to eudaimonia. Our text sets out this objection quite well with an example of someone's generosity leading them to giving beyond their limits and means. Such a case would not seem to lead to that person's flourishing. This objection, as it is articulated here, is not actually a counterexample since the person's behavior has extended beyond the golden mean into excess. However, there still may be the lingering doubt that virtue can contribute to human flourishing. Indeed, any purely theoretical conclusion will leave room for doubt when considering an empirical claim. Fortunately, there are years' worth of research available to us investigating this issue. Recall that phronesis and sphroson are central to virtue in general, in that practical wisdom and conscientiousness are required for the recognition of virtues and virtuous actions. A central facet of sophrosune, or conscientiousness, is self-control. Recent research supports Aristotle's position that self-control is an essential quality for an individual's flourishing. Terry Moffat and 12 doctors from various universities and research institutions followed the lives of over 1,000 children from birth to age 32. The study showed that childhood self-control predicts physical health, substance dependence, personal finances, and criminal offending outcomes with remarkable accuracy. The assessment of the children's self-control was based primarily on reports of research observers, teachers, parents, and the children themselves gathered across the ages of 3, 5, 7, 9, and 11 years of age, and that this data was combined into a single highly reliable composite measure. Children who were shown to have low self-control were more likely to develop cardiovascular, respiratory, dental, and sexual health problems by adulthood and were at an elevated risk for substance dependence. They were also more likely to work lower-paying jobs, have less money in the bank, raise children in a single-parent household, and to be convicted of a criminal offense, even after accounting for social class and IQ. In contrast, the children with higher self-control were more likely to do better on all points incrementally with the amount of self-control they had. These findings support the position that sophrosune is the primary virtue and the quality essential to the welfare of the individual and society. 12. Moral good and individual good. For Aristotle, it seems that moral good and individual good are both based in virtue, which is, as discussed earlier, grounded in reason. A person's individual good depends on virtue since it is a prerequisite for eudaimonia. Furthermore, a person's moral good depends on virtue because it leads to moral interactions with others, thus advancing their journey towards eudaimonia as well. Our text alludes to Aristotle's conceptions of moral and immoral people in a discussion of unified psychology and conflicted psychology. Aristotle identifies 4 characterizations of a person in terms of virtue and morality. First, there is the vicious person, who does wrong and only desires to do wrong. Second is the incontinent person, who does wrong despite desires to do right. Third is the continent person, who does right despite desires to do wrong. Finally, the fourth is the virtuous person, who does right and only desires to do right. The virtuous person is the one our text refers to as having a unified psychology, whose rational and non-rational psychologies will speak with one voice. As opposed to the other 3 non-virtuous people who have psychologies with conflict between their rational and non-rational elements. 13. Summary. Aristotelian virtue ethics is very different in nature to the other act-centered normative moral theories considered in this text. Whether this, in itself, is a virtue or a vice is an issue for your own judgment. The lack of a codified and fixed moral rule book is something many view as a flaw, while others perceive it as the key strength of the theory. Some, meanwhile, will feel uncomfortable with Aristotle's teleological claims, differing from those who are happy to accept that there is an objectively good life that is possible for human beings. Regardless, there is little doubt that Aristotelian virtue ethics offers a distinct normative moral picture and that it is a theory worthy of your reflections. 14. Questions and tasks. While the issues to consider section of our text presents 12 questions, please answer at least these 4 questions before next time. 1. Who has the better life, the happy hedonist or the virtuous individual? 2. Can you think of a virtue that does not contribute to eudaimonia? 3. Who might count as virtuous role models and why? 4. Do human beings have a telos or proper function? Why is Aristotle right or wrong about this? Before we conclude, let us practice using this ethical lens to view what some people consider to be a serious contemporary moral problem, the use of pornography. These days, indulging in this behavior is the easiest it has ever been, and every second there are an estimated 28,258 people watching online. From this moral perspective, the question is, would indulging compromise our virtue? Perhaps we conclude that indulging constitutes the vices of lust or shamelessness. In this case, if we desire to do so, then it reveals something of ourselves. If we desire it, believe it is wrong and indulge in it with no regard for what is right, then we are vicious since we are embracing shamelessness. If we desire it, believe it is wrong but indulge in it because we give in to the temptation, then we are incontinent. If we desire it but overcome our temptations out of self-control, then we are continent. If we recognize it as shameless behavior, and out of modesty have no desire for it, thus refusing to indulge, we are virtuous, and this is the state we should strive to attain. However, on this view, we can also avoid indulgence in a vicious way. Whereas shamelessness is a deficiency vice, there is also the relevant excess vice, shyness, with modesty representing the golden mean of virtue between these two vices. This is a counterintuitive result, but it is a consequence of this being an agent-centered theory, and the question is, do we really think that someone who avoids vicious behavior due to their own viciousness is actually vicious? An Aristotelian may have to say so. Such as the person we discussed who avoids indulgence out of bashfulness. However, whether this counterintuitive result is actually a problem for Aristotelian virtue ethics is a question for you to consider in your reflections.